Starting with Baroque instrumental music to the Hollywood epics of the mid-20th century, the overture has been an integral part of Western music. Although most now would suggest that an overture can be written without form, this was not always the case. And I think it is worth noting that even when the overture lost all semblance to the forms from which it arose, there were in some cases aspects of the original form that remained part of the standard practice of composers long after the overture evolved into the somewhat free form it is considered to be at the present time. Let's start with the word overture, which once again has its roots in the French Baroque and was and is spelled thusly in French. The French term is built off the French word ouvert, which means to open, so overture literally means opening. Early overtures were used to open many different pieces, from instrumental works to operas and even early symphonies. By the 18th century, two forms of overtures would develop, and most early classical overtures can be divided into variants of these two forms. These two forms were the Italian and French overture, which were associated with the earliest composers who employed them. The first being Jean-Baptiste Lully for the French overture and Alessandro Scarlatti for the Italian overture. So what is the difference between these two forms? Due to the great number of exceptions, I will have to keep the definition as general as possible. An Italian overture, for example, starts with a fast section, which is followed by a slow section, which then returns to the same fast section. A famous example of this is Mozart's overture to his famous opera, The Abduction from the Seraglio. This principle of fast, slow, fast would become the basis for classical symphonies, sonatas, and concertos. But instead of one singular piece of music being divided into fast, slow, fast, these later works would be divided into three movements, which would follow the same mold. So movement 1 would be fast, movement 2 slow, and the third movement fast again. Save the addition of a fourth, moderately fast movement in symphonies and sonatas during the late classical and early romantic period. This concept of fast, slow, fast remained the norm until the 20th century. Of course, there were always exceptions, but fast, slow, fast was the general rule of thumb for symphonies, concertos, and sonatas. The second and earliest form of overture is the French overture. This form is more or less the exact opposite of the Italian overture, meaning instead of fast, slow, fast, a French overture is slow, fast, slow. However, it should be noted that in a French overture, the fast section is usually significantly longer. Oftentimes, this fast section takes on the form of a fugato being a piece of music that begins like a fugue, but doesn't quite develop into a traditional fugue, so basically, it's a fugal impostor. It should be noted that French overtures often forgo the recapitulation of the slow section, as seen in Mozart's overture to the Magic Flute, which also begins its fast section with a fugato. It should be noted that not all French overtures employ the fugato in their fast section, such as in Mozart's overture to Don Giovanni. Another aspect of French overtures to take note of is its influence on the sonata form. I will eventually make a video on the sonata form, but for now I will focus on a certain characteristic of sonata form that began to develop at the beginning of the 19th century. This characteristic being the slow introduction, which was added to pieces written in sonata form. The slow introduction was only used in the first movement or opening of sonatas or symphonies, thus showing the influence the French overture would have on the more complex sonata form. As with the French overture, the slow introduction is followed by music written in a faster tempo, which can be seen in the following examples. Over the years, the traditional forms used for overtures would become more obscure as overtures took on more programmatic tendencies, and often were written as standalone works. By the middle of the 19th century, overtures no longer followed these strict forms and began to simply set the mood of the piece that followed. Wagner, for example, eventually dropped the term overture altogether in his operas, instead opting for pieces entitled Vorspiel or Prelude. And when the term overture was used, it was generally written free of form, and simply written to convey the mood of what was to follow, which is generally the way movie overtures were composed, such as Maurice Jarre's overture to Lawrence of Arabia. Even as early as Mozart and Beethoven, the overture began to depart from these forms, with overtures often being written using iterations of the sonata form, thus showing how the cross-pollination of the French overture and the sonata form might have come to fruition. I, however, submit that the forms might not have died entirely. Let's take a look at Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, for example. On the surface, this piece has almost nothing to do with the aforementioned forms, but when I was listening to it recently, I realized that Tchaikovsky for a moment revives a characteristic found in French overtures, and I don't think this is a coincidence, since the piece is about Napoleon's defeat in Russia. Towards the end of the piece, Tchaikovsky opted to turn the French Marseillaise into a fugato. What better way to invoke the French than not only to play the Marseillaise, but to turn it into a fugato, which was of course a defining characteristic of French overtures. Be it the adoption of the Italian overtures' fast, slow, fast form and the movement pattern of symphonies, sonatas, and concertos, or the slow introduction adopted from the French overture in the first movement of a larger work written in sonata form, or even Tchaikovsky's application of a fugato to convey the French programmatically and formulaically, one can begin to see how more or less dead musical forms can leave their mark on works written decades and even centuries after a form's popularity has expired.